Hi, my name is Michael Wolf, and today I will be presenting on SVMs, SVCs, and the kernel trick. To first understand support vector machines, or SVMs, we need to understand what support vectors are. Simply defined, these are samples in a given classification problem that are the closest to the decision boundary. So these are 2 points that most closely resemble each other, or in more mathematical terms, have the closest Euclidean distance or whatever distance measure that you are using. So visually represented, here we have a classification problem. This is your pretty standard, binary classification. We have, blue dots representing one classification and then green representing the other. The support vectors are these two dots highlighted by the arrows. So these two, or rather these three, are most closely related to each other from a distance standpoint, and they're the ones that define the hyperplane. Now, the hyperplane is the decision boundary, the breadth of the decision boundary, which is defined by these underlined equations here. So w by x minus b. And as you can see, with the answer to those being 1, 0, and 1, these are what represents whether or not we determine these particular support vectors to be a part of a classification or not. As you can imagine, support vectors have the highest amount of leverage on a given classification problem. So if you move them, then that usually changes what the decision boundary looks like. If you remove them, it makes the hyperplane wider. Conversely, if you move them closer to each other, then it makes the hyperplane more narrow and makes the makes the classification more sort of restricted. So in linear classification, as I mentioned, the underlined equation is used to create the hyperplane, with W representing the normal vector to the hyperplane from the decision boundary. So the equation is therefore derived using these SVMs that I've highlighted on the screen. So what about nonlinear? So linear classification requires data to be represented as feature vectors. So you can see that on the screen here. This is the feature vector that we use to define our support. One way to work around this is to use a kernel trick. So feature vectors, if you're going to do a linear classification, whether it's a binary class or multiple classes like you see in this 2D scatter plot, these require a good amount of user-defined functions to create these pairs, which this is represented in the amount of code that you have to write, essentially to clean up the data to create your feature vectors. This can get quite complicated to the point where your code may not really represent classification in its purest form by the time you have it written. But one way to work around this is through the kernel trick. And if you look at the 3D feature space in the center, this is essentially, put very, very simply, this puts the 2D classification into a 3D space, which can make the decision boundaries a little more separable than it might be in a more sort of complex 2D space. For example, if you look to the right here, it isn't very linearly separable, although it can be. So how does this all work? So kernels are instance-based functions that compute a weight for each sample of data. So they don't necessarily require, foreknowledge of whatever your pairwise distance function might be that you're using to create your feature vectors. Instead, they just look at the specific instance of the pairwise features to compute the weight. There's several types of equations. I've got 4 of them on the screen here for linear, polynomial, Gaussian, or radial, and sigmoid support vectors. In each of these equations, the k variable is what represents our kernel. This is the function that we define to compute that instance-based uh, uh, distance weight for those particular pairs. So in a linear example, which is our simplest example, our kernel function simply takes these x pairs and then creates them into a weight for these two pairs. And this is really handy for sort of projecting these into a higher space, because we don't actually have to have foreknowledge of what these pairs are going to be in order to convert them into some kind of vector. Instead, we just require them to be in their rawest form and be able to be easily computed by this K kernel. And obviously this can get more complicated as you push into polynomial spaces or Gaussian spaces, where you can take an exponential function or a tangent function, and this works particularly well if you don't have a clear sort of linear separation between your classifications. So let's look at a practical example of this. So as I mentioned, when you don't have clearly linearly separable classifiers, then this is where your kernel trick comes in handy. So in this one, in this particular example, we have sort of one cluster in the center and then sort of an outer cluster, and each of these represents a different class. Now, obviously, a linear classifier would not work well in this case, and I've sort of highlighted that here. You can see we've got a hyperplane that basically takes up most of this 2D space. Even then, it's not really, it's going to misclassify nearly everything. I mean, this obviously is not going to be a very accurate classifier, just visually. So what does this look like from a kernel trick perspective? So here, what I've done is implemented a Gaussian kernel. So we saw that, I mentioned that earlier, with the Gaussian, also known as a radial kernel. This is able to take some of these more sort of clustered classifiers and project them into a 3D space. So you can see we've taken some of these distance measurements between kind of this inner circle of the red classifier along with the outer circle of the yellow classifier. And then this is our formula right here. So as you saw, all it takes is just a simple, exponent of the absolute value of our x feature space. So this is that pairwise distance measurement that I mentioned before. So we take that squared and then sum those two pairs together, take the exponent, and that enables us to create our radial function. So here's the full code, and this is fairly simple code. I'm not really doing a whole lot here. My user-defined functions here are pretty simple. It's just creating a 3D plot and then creating a decision function plot. Where the magic is really happening is really down here, and I showed this before. This is my radial function, once I'm implementing those and pushing those through my 3D function, you're able to see kind of how those are more separated in a 3D feature space, as we saw in the previous slide, once we apply the radial function.